Captain Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of flying. As a little girl in rural Texas, she would lie in the wheat fields behind her family's farm, watching military jets streak across the endless blue sky. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, told her stories of brave pilots who protected their country from thousands of feet above the ground. Sarah knew from that moment what she wanted to be. Growing up wasn't easy for Sarah. Her family struggled financially after her father lost his job at the local factory. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. But Sarah never let their circumstances dim her dreams. She studied hard, earned top grades, and spent every free moment reading about aviation and military history. When Sarah turned 18, she enlisted in the Air Force immediately after high school graduation. The military offered her a path to college and flight training that her family could never afford. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah pushed through every challenge. Her drill sergeants noticed something special about her determination and focus. After completing her initial training, Sarah applied for pilot school. The competition was fierce, with hundreds of candidates fighting for just a few spots. Many of her male colleagues doubted whether a small-town girl could handle the pressure of flying multi-million-dollar fighter jets. Sarah proved them wrong during every test and simulation. Flight school tested every limit of Sarah's physical and mental abilities. She learned to handle G-forces that would make most people pass out. She mastered complex navigation systems, weapons targeting, and emergency procedures. Her instructors were impressed by her natural flying instincts and calm demeanor under extreme pressure. Sarah graduated at the top of her class and earned the right to fly the F-16 Fighting Falcon. The sleek, powerful aircraft became an extension of her body and mind. She could feel every vibration of the engine, sense every shift in wind resistance, and react to threats in split seconds. Her fellow pilots respected her skills and trusted her judgment in dangerous situations. By age 28, Sarah had completed 2 combat deployments overseas. She had flown dozens of missions over hostile territory, protecting ground troops and defending strategic targets. Her commanding officers recognized her exceptional abilities and recommended her for advanced training programs. Sarah's career was on a fast track to success, but Sarah's personal life remained complicated. The demands of military service made maintaining relationships nearly impossible. She had dated a few fellow officers, but the long deployments and constant training schedules always got in the way. Her parents worried about her safety and wished she would settle down with a nice civilian job. Sarah's squadron was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, home to some of the military's most advanced training programs. The desert location provided perfect conditions for practicing combat maneuvers and testing new technologies. Sarah loved the clear skies and challenging terrain that kept her flying skills sharp. During routine training exercises, Sarah often flew against experienced pilots in simulated dogfights. These mock battles helped prepare her for real combat situations, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. Sarah consistently outperformed her opponents, earning a reputation as one of the squadron's most skilled and reliable pilots. The other pilots in Sarah's unit came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared a common bond of service and dedication. They trained together, deployed together, and looked out for each other like family. Sarah formed close friendships with several of her fellow aviators, including Captain Mike Rodriguez and Lieutenant Jennifer Chin, Sarah's commanding officer. Colonel James Thompson had served in the military for over 20 years. He had flown combat missions in several conflicts and understood the unique pressures faced by fighter pilots. Colonel Thompson became a mentor to Sarah, helping her navigate the challenges of military life and preparing her for greater responsibilities. As tensions began rising between major world powers, Sarah's training took on new urgency. Intelligence briefings revealed concerning developments in global politics and military buildups. The pilots were told to maintain peak readiness for potential deployment to crisis areas around the world. Sarah knew that her skills and training might soon be tested in ways she had never imagined. The peaceful training flights over the Nevada desert could quickly be replaced by real combat missions with actual enemy threats. She felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in her abilities and committed to protecting her country and fellow service members. The briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with nervous energy as Colonel Thompson addressed his pilots. World events had taken a dangerous turn overnight. A terrorist organization, had somehow acquired nuclear materials from a former Soviet republic and was threatening to detonate a weapon in a major European city unless their demands were met. Sarah listened intently as intelligence officers explained the situation. The terrorist group had sophisticated backing from an unknown state sponsor. They possessed not just nuclear materials but also advanced delivery systems and detailed knowledge of Western defense capabilities. This wasn't the work of amateur extremists operating from caves. European allies were scrambling to respond to the crisis. Emergency meetings at NATO headquarters continued around the clock as military leaders developed response plans. Several countries had already raised their alert levels to the highest possible status. Commercial flights were being grounded, and major cities were beginning evacuations of key government buildings. Sarah's squadron received orders to deploy immediately to a classified location in Eastern Europe. Their F-16s would join an international coalition force, preparing for potential military action against the terrorist stronghold. The mission details remained classified, but everyone understood the stakes had never been higher. The flight to Europe took 14 hours with multiple aerial refueling stops. Sarah's F-16 performed flawlessly during the long journey, but she couldn't shake a growing sense of unease about their destination. Intelligence reports suggested the terrorist group possessed advanced anti-aircraft systems that could threaten even the most sophisticated fighter jets. Upon arrival at the forward operating base, Sarah was shocked by the massive military buildup already in progress. Aircraft from dozens of countries lined the runways, while thousands of support personnel worked around the clock to maintain combat readiness. The base commander briefed incoming pilots on the rapidly evolving situation. The terrorist group had issued a new ultimatum, demanding the release of imprisoned extremist leaders and the withdrawal of Western forces from several key regions. They claimed to have multiple nuclear devices hidden in major cities and threatened simultaneous detonations. If their demands weren't met within 72 hours, Sarah's squadron was assigned to conduct reconnaissance flights over the suspected terrorist stronghold deep in mountainous terrain. The missions required flying at extremely low altitudes to avoid radar detection, while gathering intelligence on enemy positions and defensive capabilities. These flights were among the most dangerous in military aviation. During her first reconnaissance mission, Sarah flew her F-16 through narrow mountain valleys at nearly supersonic speeds. Her aircraft's sensors detected multiple surface-to-air missile sites and what appeared to be a heavily fortified underground complex. The intelligence she gathered confirmed everyone's worst fears about the sophistication of the terrorist operation. Back at base, Sarah participated in planning sessions for potential strike missions against the terrorist stronghold. Military leaders were developing multiple scenarios from precision surgical strikes to full-scale assault operations. Each plan carried enormous risks and uncertain outcomes, with the constant threat of nuclear retaliation hanging over every decision. The international coalition included pilots and aircraft from over 20 nations, creating complex coordination challenges. Different countries operated various aircraft types with unique capabilities and limitations. Sarah found herself working closely with pilots from Britain, France, Germany, and several other allied nations as they prepared for possible joint operations. Communication intercepts revealed growing instability within the terrorist organization itself. Intelligence analysts detected heated arguments among the group's leaders about timing and targets for their threatened nuclear attacks. Some faction members appeared to be having second thoughts about the massive casualties their plan would cause. Sarah's second reconnaissance mission took her even deeper into hostile territory. Flying through a heavily defended valley where the terrorist group's main command center was believed to be located, anti-aircraft fire erupted from multiple positions as her F-16 raced between mountain peaks, but she managed to complete her mission and return safely with crucial intelligence data. The information Sarah and other pilots gathered revealed the true scope of the terrorist threat. The underground facility was far larger than initially estimated, with extensive tunnel networks and multiple launch sites for nuclear-capable missiles. The complexity of the installation suggested years of careful planning and massive financial resources. World leaders faced an impossible choice as the terrorist deadline approached. Military action against such a well-defended position would likely result in heavy casualties and might trigger the very nuclear attacks they were trying to prevent. But allowing the terrorists to succeed would only encourage future attacks and potentially destabilize the entire global order. Sarah spent sleepless nights in her quarters, knowing that she and her fellow pilots might soon be ordered to fly missions that could determine the fate of millions of innocent people. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than anything she had experienced during her previous combat deployments. Every decision in the coming hours could have consequences that would echo through history. The terrorist deadline expired at midnight European time, but instead of detonating their threatened nuclear devices, the group released a chilling video message. Their masked leader announced that the weapons were now armed and set for automatic detonation if their stronghold came under attack. Any military action would trigger a nuclear response that would kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Sarah watched the video in the base briefing room alongside her fellow pilots, feeling her blood turn cold as the implications became clear. The terrorists had created a deadlock where any attempt to stop them could result in the very catastrophe everyone was trying to prevent. Military leaders across the coalition struggled to find a solution to this impossible scenario. Intelligence intercepts revealed that the terrorist group had indeed rigged their nuclear devices with sophisticated triggering mechanisms linked to seismic sensors around their mountain stronghold. Any significant explosion or ground disturbance would automatically set off the weapons hidden in major European cities. The terrorists had effectively made themselves untouchable through the threat of massive civilian casualties. Coalition commanders ordered all offensive operations to be put on hold while political leaders desperately searched for diplomatic solutions. But time was running out as the terrorist group began making increasingly erratic demands. Their communications suggested growing paranoia and instability among the leadership, making the situation even more unpredictable and dangerous. Sarah's squadron continued flying reconnaissance missions to monitor the terrorist stronghold, but they were forbidden from taking any aggressive action. The pilots felt frustrated and helpless, watching their enemy through their targeting systems while being unable to neutralize the threat. Every flight brought reports of increased activity at the terrorist facility. During one reconnaissance flight, Sarah detected unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from the terrorist complex. Her aircraft sensors indicated the presence of powerful transmission equipment that hadn't been there during previous missions. Intelligence analysts suspected the terrorists were preparing to activate their nuclear devices remotely if they felt threatened. The situation deteriorated further when intercepted communications revealed a split within the terrorist organization. A hardline faction led by the group's second-in-command was planning to detonate the nuclear weapons regardless of whether their demands were met. They believed that massive civilian casualties would advance their twisted ideological goals more effectively than any negotiated settlement. Sarah found herself struggling with the moral weight of the crisis during her off-duty hours. She had joined the military to protect innocent people, but now she was forced to stand by helplessly while terrorists held millions of lives hostage. Sleep became impossible as she imagined the faces of the potential victims in the threatened cities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when a low-level member of the terrorist organization contacted coalition intelligence officers through encrypted channels. The defector revealed crucial details about the nuclear triggering system and offered to provide access codes that could disable the automatic detonation mechanisms. But the intelligence windfall came with a devastating catch. The defector explained that the nuclear devices could only be safely disarmed from within the terrorist stronghold itself. Someone would need to penetrate the heavily defended facility and manually input the disabling codes at each weapon's location. The mission would be essentially suicidal. Coalition special forces began planning a desperate infiltration mission, but their commanders privately acknowledged that success was unlikely. The terrorist complex was too well defended, and even if troops managed to reach the nuclear devices, they would probably be detected and killed before completing their mission. The automatic triggers would still activate, resulting in the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. Sarah volunteered immediately when she learned about the planned ground mission, but Colonel Thompson refused to consider putting his pilots at risk in such a hopeless operation. However, Sarah's tactical mind was already working on an alternative approach that might succeed where conventional tactics would fail. That evening, Sarah studied detailed reconnaissance photos of the terrorist stronghold with fresh eyes. Her pilot's perspective revealed something that ground commanders had missed. The facility's main command center was located in a natural depression surrounded by steep mountain walls. The terrain created a unique opportunity for an aerial approach that could bypass most of the defensive systems. Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity. A single F-16 could approach the target at extremely low altitude, using the mountain terrain to mask its approach from radar and visual detection. The pilot could then dive vertically into the facility's central courtyard, penetrating deep enough into the underground complex to reach the command center before the automatic triggers could activate. The mission would require precise timing and perfect execution. The pilot would need to survive the initial penetration, locate and disable the nuclear triggering system, and somehow escape before enemy forces could respond. Sarah knew the odds of survival were virtually zero, but she also knew it might be the only way to save millions of innocent lives. Colonel Thompson initially rejected Sarah's proposal as pure suicide, but as hours passed without any other viable options, he began to see the desperate logic in her plan. The terrorist deadline for beginning nuclear detonations was less than 18 hours away, and no other solutions had emerged from the frantic planning sessions. Sarah spent the early morning hours meticulously planning every detail of her suicide mission. She studied the terrorist facility's layout until she could navigate it blindfolded, memorizing the location of every defensive position and the most likely routes to the underground command center. Her F-16 would need to be modified for this unique mission profile. The base's technical crew worked frantically to prepare Sarah's aircraft for the unprecedented assault. They removed unnecessary equipment to reduce weight and installed additional armor plating around the cockpit. Extra fuel tanks were mounted to extend her range, and the aircraft's targeting systems were fine-tuned for the air. Precision required to hit such a small target from a steep diving angle. Colonel Thompson called Sarah into his office for a final briefing as the sun rose over the base. The older officer's face showed the strain of the impossible decisions he was being forced to make. He had served in combat for decades, but never faced a scenario where success required sacrificing one of his best pilots in what amounted to a controlled crash. Sarah's fellow pilots gathered in the hangar as she prepared for takeoff, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and horror at what she was attempting. Captain Rodriguez shook her hand silently, unable to find words for the situation. Lieutenant Chen gave her a small Christian cross, saying it had protected her through many dangerous missions. The flight to the target area would take Sarah across 3 countries at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection. She would have no backup, no support, and no realistic hope of survival. If her mission failed, millions of innocent people in major European cities would die when the nuclear devices detonated automatically. Sarah's F-16 lifted off from the base just as the morning sun broke over the horizon. She felt strangely calm as she settled into the familiar routine of flight operations, running through her pre-mission checklists with the same precision she had practiced thousands of times. The weight of what lay ahead seemed almost secondary to the immediate demands of flying her aircraft safely. The first leg of her journey took Sarah across friendly territory at barely 50 feet above the ground, her F-16 screaming between hills and through valleys at nearly 600 miles per hour. She had to maintain this dangerous altitude to stay below enemy radar coverage while approaching the target zone. One small mistake could send her aircraft crashing into the terrain. As Sarah crossed into hostile airspace, her aircraft's warning systems began detecting surface-to-air missile sites and radar installations throughout the region. The terrorist organization had invested heavily in air defense systems, creating overlapping fields of coverage that would normally make low-level penetration impossible. But Sarah's unconventional approach route exploited gaps in their defensive network. The terrorist stronghold appeared on Sarah's targeting display as she began her final approach through a narrow mountain valley. Intelligence reports indicated that over 300 armed militants were defending the facility, supported by heavy weapons and sophisticated communications equipment. Her chances of surviving long enough to complete the mission remained virtually zero. Sarah's hands remained steady on the flight controls as she initiated her attack dive from 12,000 feet above the target. The F-16 plummeted toward the terrorist facility at over 700 miles per hour, its engines screaming as the aircraft built up tremendous kinetic energy for the impact that would hopefully penetrate deep into the underground complex. Ground-based defenders spotted Sarah's aircraft during the final seconds of her dive and opened fire with everything they had. Tracer rounds and missile contrails filled the air around her F-16, but the extreme speed and steep angle of her approach made accurate targeting nearly impossible. Sarah felt several impacts against her aircraft's armored hull without any critical systems failing. The moment of impact came faster than Sarah had anticipated, even after countless simulation runs. Her F-16 struck the concrete courtyard of the terrorist facility with devastating force, its reinforced nose cone punching through multiple layers of flooring and into the underground command center. The aircraft's momentum carried it deep into the facility before friction and structural damage finally brought it to a stop. Sarah somehow survived the controlled crash, though her aircraft was completely destroyed and she was trapped in the wreckage deep underground. Emergency lighting flickered in the damaged command center as terrorist fighters began rushing toward her position. She had perhaps minutes to locate and disable the nuclear triggering system before enemy forces reached her. Fighting through pain from multiple injuries sustained during the impact, Sarah forced herself out of the twisted cockpit and began searching for the control system she had memorized from intelligence reports. The command center was filled with sophisticated computer equipment and communications gear, much of it damaged by the crash but still partially functional. Sarah found the nuclear triggering system exactly where the defector had indicated it would be located. The complex array of computers and monitoring equipment was still operational, despite the destruction around it. She pulled out the disabling codes that the terrorist defector had provided and began inputting them into the system's main terminal. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the damaged corridors as Sarah worked frantically to disable each nuclear device in sequence. The codes worked exactly as promised, but the process required several minutes to complete as each weapon had to be individually disarmed through the central control system. Time was running out as hostile voices grew closer to her position. Sarah managed to disable the last nuclear device, just as the first terrorist fighters burst into the damaged command center. She raised her hands in surrender, knowing that her mission was complete and that millions of innocent lives had been saved. The nuclear weapons hidden in European cities were now harmless, their triggering mechanisms permanently disabled. The terrorist fighters surrounded Sarah with their weapons drawn, shouting in multiple languages as they tried to understand what had happened to their supposedly impregnable stronghold. Their leaders would soon discover that their nuclear threat no longer existed, leaving them vulnerable to the coalition forces gathering outside their mountain hideout. Sarah found herself dragged through dark corridors by angry terrorists who still didn't understand what had just happened to their operation. They threw her into a small concrete cell carved out of the mountain rock, her injuries from the crash making every movement painful. Blood trickled from cuts on her face and arms, but she was alive against all odds. The terrorist leader who had appeared in the threatening videos arrived at Sarah's cell within an hour of her capture. He was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and spoke perfect English with a slight accent she couldn't identify. His rage was barely controlled as he demanded to know how she had penetrated their defenses and what she had done to their command systems. Sarah remained silent during the initial interrogation, following her military training to reveal only her name, rank, and service number. The terrorist leader grew increasingly frustrated as his technical experts reported that their nuclear triggering system had been completely disabled. Years of planning and millions of dollars in preparation had been destroyed by a single pilot's desperate mission. Coalition forces outside the mountain stronghold received word that Sarah's mission had succeeded when their monitoring stations detected the shutdown of the nuclear triggering systems. Military commanders immediately ordered a full-scale assault on the terrorist facility, knowing that their enemy's nuclear threat had been eliminated and their captured pilot needed rescue. The attack began with massive airstrikes against the facility's external defenses, followed by special forces teams rappelling from helicopters directly onto the mountain peaks surrounding the complex. Sarah could hear the sounds of battle echoing through the rocky corridors as coalition troops fought their way deeper into the underground maze. Her captors became increasingly desperate as their defensive positions fell one by one to the advancing coalition forces. Sarah listened to frantic radio communications in several languages as terrorist fighters reported heavy casualties and requested reinforcements that were no longer available. Their carefully planned fortress was crumbling under sustained military assault. The terrorist leader returned to Sarah's cell as explosions shook dust from the ceiling above them. He had clearly given up hope of escape and seemed focused only on revenge against the pilot who had destroyed his organization's grand plans. Sarah could see in his eyes that he intended to kill her before the coalition forces could complete their rescue operation. But Sarah's military training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. During a moment when her guard was distracted by nearby gunfire, she managed to grab his sidearm and turn the tables on her captors. Years of combat training and physical conditioning gave her the advantage she needed, despite her injuries from the crash. Sarah fought her way out of the detention area just as coalition special forces breached the facility's inner defenses. The familiar sound of American and British accents calling out tactical positions filled her with relief as she realized that rescue was finally at hand. She called out her identity and location to avoid being mistaken for an enemy combatant. The reunion with coalition forces came in a damaged corridor, lit only by emergency lighting and the glow of fires burning throughout the facility. Sarah had never been happier to see fellow soldiers as the Special Forces team provided medical attention for her injuries and prepared to evacuate her from the underground complex. However, their escape route was blocked by the remaining terrorist fighters who had barricaded themselves into defensive positions throughout the facility. The coalition forces would need to fight their way out through heavily defended corridors while protecting their injured pilot. The mission was far from over despite the success of disabling the nuclear threat. Sarah insisted on carrying a weapon and participating in the fighting withdrawal despite her injuries. Her knowledge of the facility's layout, gained during her desperate search for the command center, proved invaluable in helping the Special Forces team navigate through the maze of corridors and avoid ambush positions. The battle inside the mountain continued for several more hours as coalition forces systematically cleared each level of the underground complex. Sarah stayed close to the Special Forces team, providing covering fire when needed and helping to treat wounded soldiers who had been injured during the assault operation. As they finally reached the surface, Sarah saw the full scale of the military operation that had been mounted to rescue her and eliminate the terrorist threat. Dozens of aircraft circled overhead, while armored vehicles and artillery positions surrounded the mountain facility. The international coalition had committed massive resources to ending this crisis. The terrorist organization's surviving members were either captured or killed during the final phases of the assault operation. Their sophisticated stronghold, which had taken years to construct and fortify, was completely destroyed by controlled demolitions to prevent any future use by hostile forces. The nuclear materials they had stolen were secured by specialized teams and safely removed. Sarah was immediately evacuated to a military hospital for treatment of her injuries, but she insisted on debriefing coalition intelligence officers about everything she had observed during her time inside the terrorist facility. Her first-hand knowledge helped investigators understand how the organization had operated and identify any remaining threats. The world's media quickly learned about Sarah's heroic mission, though many details remained classified for security reasons. News reports described how a single American fighter pilot had prevented nuclear attacks that could have killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Sarah became an international hero overnight, though she remained focused on her recovery and eventual return to active duty. Medical examinations revealed that Sarah's injuries from the controlled crash were more serious than initially realized. She had suffered multiple fractures and internal injuries that would require months of rehabilitation, but she was alive and millions of people in major cities around the world were safe because of her courage and sacrifice. The military hospital in Germany where Sarah was taken became her world for the next several months. What doctors initially thought were relatively minor injuries from the crash turned out to be far more serious. Internal bleeding, spinal compression, and traumatic brain injury from the violent impact had left her fighting for her life in ways that flying combat missions never had. Sarah slipped into a coma 3 days after the rescue, her body finally succumbing to the trauma it had endured during the suicide mission. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize her condition, performing multiple surgeries to repair internal damage and reduce swelling in her brain. Her parents flew in from Texas, maintaining a bedside vigil that lasted for weeks. The media attention surrounding Sarah's heroic mission intensified during her hospitalization. World leaders praised her courage, and she received thousands of letters from grateful citizens whose lives she had saved. Military officials from dozens of countries visited the hospital to pay their respects, but Sarah remained unconscious and unaware of the recognition her actions had earned. Colonel Thompson visited Sarah whenever his duties allowed, often sitting quietly beside her bed reading mission reports or sharing updates about their squadron. He blamed himself for approving such a dangerous mission, even though everyone understood that no other option existed. The guilt of sending one of his pilots on what amounted to a suicide mission weighed heavily on his conscience. Sarah's fellow pilots from her squadron took turns visiting during their leave time, maintaining the strong bonds of friendship that had developed during their years of service together. Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen became regular fixtures at the hospital, often spending entire days in the waiting room hoping for any sign of improvement in their friend's condition. After 6 weeks in a coma, Sarah finally began showing signs of consciousness. Her first words were barely whispers, asking about the mission and whether the nuclear threat had been eliminated. When doctors confirmed that her sacrifice had saved millions of lives, she smiled weakly and closed her eyes, seeming to find peace in knowing that her mission had succeeded. The road to recovery proved far more challenging than any combat mission Sarah had ever flown. She had to relearn basic functions like walking and talking, her body slowly rebuilding strength that had been shattered by the violent crash. Physical therapy sessions were grueling, but Sarah approached them with the same determination that had made her an exceptional pilot. Doctors discovered that Sarah had suffered permanent damage to her inner ear during the crash, destroying the delicate balance mechanisms that pilots depend on for spatial orientation. The injury meant that she would never be able to fly military aircraft again, ending the career that had defined her entire adult life. The news devastated Sarah more than any of her physical injuries. Sarah's parents stayed in Germany for months, taking leaves of absence from their jobs to support their daughter's recovery. They had always worried about her dangerous military career, but seeing her fight for basic functions, like walking and speaking, made them understand the true price of her heroic service to others. The rehabilitation process included not just physical therapy but also psychological counseling to help Sarah cope with the trauma of her experience and the loss of her flying career. She struggled with depression and survivor guilt, wondering why she had been spared when so many other good people had died in military service over the years. International recognition for Sarah's heroism continued to pour in during her recovery. She received medals from multiple countries, honorary degrees from universities, and invitations to speak at events around the world. But Sarah remained focused primarily on regaining enough strength to live independently and find a new purpose in life. The hardest part of recovery was accepting that she would never fly again. Sarah had defined herself as a pilot since childhood, and losing that identity felt like losing a fundamental part of who she was. She watched jets flying overhead from the hospital courtyard, feeling a mixture of longing and sadness for the career that had been taken from her. Sarah's medical team included specialists from several countries who were fascinated by her case. The fact that she had survived such a violent crash and was making any recovery at all defied medical expectations. Her progress became a source of inspiration for other patients dealing with traumatic injuries. After 8 months of intensive treatment, Sarah was finally ready to return to the United States for continued rehabilitation at a military medical facility in Texas. She could walk with assistance and had regained most of her cognitive functions, but still faced months or years of additional therapy to reach her maximum potential recovery. The flight back to America was Sarah's first time in an aircraft since her suicide mission, and the experience brought back vivid memories of that desperate dive into the terrorist stronghold. She gripped the armrests tightly during takeoff and landing, her body remembering the terror of controlled flight ending in violent impact. Sarah's homecoming in Texas was emotional for her entire family and community. Local media covered her arrival, and hundreds of supporters gathered at the airport to welcome home their hometown hero. But Sarah felt disconnected from the celebration, still struggling to understand her place in a world where she could no longer fly. The final phase of Sarah's medical treatment focused on preparing her for civilian life and helping her develop new skills to replace her military career. Vocational counselors worked with her to explore options that could utilize her experience and knowledge while accommodating her physical limitations. The transition from combat pilot to civilian would prove to be another form of impossible challenge. 2 years after her suicide mission, Sarah stood before a classroom of young Air Force cadets at the academy in Colorado Springs. Her legs still trembled slightly from the nerve damage sustained in the crash, but her voice was strong and clear as she shared her story with the future officers gathered before her. This had become her new mission, inspiring the next generation of military leaders. The transition from combat pilot to instructor and motivational speaker had been the hardest challenge of Sarah's life. Learning to walk again had been difficult, but learning to find purpose without flying had nearly broken her spirit. Depression and anger dominated her first year of recovery, as she struggled to accept that her flying days were permanently over. Sarah's breakthrough came during a visit to a veterans hospital where she met other wounded warriors dealing with their own impossible challenges. A young Marine who had lost both legs in Afghanistan told her that her story had inspired him to keep fighting during his own darkest moments. Sarah realized that her greatest mission might still lie ahead of her. With the support of her former colleagues and military leadership, Sarah developed a program to train pilots in crisis decision-making and survival techniques. Her first-hand experience with impossible situations made her uniquely qualified to teach others how to find solutions when conventional approaches failed. The program became mandatory training for all fighter pilots in the Air Force. Sarah also began working with international aviation organizations to improve aircraft safety systems and emergency procedures. Her technical knowledge, combined with her experience of surviving an unsurvivable crash, provided insights that helped engineers design better, protective equipment for military and civilian pilots. The speaking engagements that had started as part of her therapy became a full-time career as organizations around the world requested Sarah's insights on leadership, courage, and overcoming adversity. She traveled extensively despite her physical limitations, sharing her story with audiences ranging from corporate executives to high school students. Sarah's relationship with Captain Rodriguez, her former squadron mate, had developed into something deeper during her recovery. Mike had been a constant source of support during her darkest days, and their shared understanding of military life created a foundation for lasting love. They married in a simple ceremony attended by their Air Force family. The couple eventually settled in Colorado, where Sarah continued her work at the Air Force Academy, while Mike pursued his own advancement in the service. They built a life together that honored their military past while embracing new possibilities for the future. Sarah found joy in mentoring young officers and helping them develop the skills and character needed for service. Sarah's work with trauma survivors expanded beyond the military community. She established a foundation to help other people who had suffered life-changing injuries find new purposes and rebuild their lives. The organization provided counseling, vocational training, and financial assistance to individuals facing seemingly impossible challenges. The physical limitations from Sarah's injuries never completely disappeared, but she learned to work within them rather than being defeated by them. Daily exercise and physical therapy helped maintain her strength and mobility, while adaptive technologies allowed her to continue contributing in ways she had never imagined during her flying career. Sarah's story continued to inspire people around the world years after her heroic mission. Books and documentaries chronicled her journey from small-town girl to combat pilot, to wounded warrior to inspirational leader. But Sarah remained focused on the present rather than dwelling on past glories or setbacks. The young cadets in Sarah's classroom listened intently as she concluded her lecture on crisis leadership. She had taught them that sometimes the impossible solution is the only solution, and that success often requires sacrifice beyond anything they had previously imagined. Her life proved that even when one dream ends, new purposes and possibilities can emerge from the ashes. After class, several students approached Sarah with questions about her experience and advice for their own military careers. She saw in their eager faces the same dreams and determination that had driven her own journey from the wheat fields of Texas to the cockpit of an F-16. The circle of inspiration and service continued with each new generation. Sarah's evening routine now included a walk around the academy grounds with Mike, often stopping to watch training flights as young pilots practiced their skills in the Colorado sky. She no longer felt the sharp pain of loss when observing aircraft in flight, but rather a sense of pride in knowing that her sacrifice had made their peaceful training possible. The impossible had become possible in Sarah's life. Not just once during her suicide mission, but repeatedly as she rebuilt herself from the wreckage of her former dreams. Her journey proved that heroes aren't defined by single moments of glory, but by their ability to keep serving others even when everything they once were has been stripped away. 10 years after that desperate dive into the terrorist stronghold, Sarah received a call that would change her life once again. NASA had contacted her about a new position, developing safety protocols for their upcoming missions to Mars. The space agency needed someone who understood both the technical aspects of flight and the psychological challenges of impossible missions. Sarah's work with NASA represented the culmination of her journey from destruction to renewal. She would help prepare astronauts for the ultimate impossible mission, traveling to another planet knowing that rescue might never come. Her experience with facing certain death and finding a way to survive made her uniquely qualified for this role. The young woman, who had once dreamed of flying while lying in Texas wheat fields, had never imagined that her path would lead to the stars. But as Sarah looked up at the night sky from her Colorado home, she understood that some dreams don't end. They just transform into something even greater than we originally dared to imagine. Her story became a testament to the power of human resilience and the truth that beating the impossible isn't about avoiding failure or injury. It's about refusing to let those setbacks define the limits of what you can still become. Sarah had saved millions of lives with her courage, but perhaps her greatest victory was saving herself from despair and finding new ways to serve. As she prepared for this next chapter of her remarkable journey, Sarah carried with her the lessons learned from every impossible challenge she had faced. The girl who had dreamed of protecting others by flying high above them had discovered that sometimes the greatest protection comes from standing beside people and showing them that no challenge is truly insurmountable. Sarah Mitchell had beaten the impossible not once, but again and again, proving that the human spirit can rise from any wreckage to find new skies to conquer.